Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the InduSoft webinar about system security. About 2 weeks ago, we hosted a webinar talking about cyber attacks, cybersecurity, especially from an IT perspective. And today, we will talk a little bit about system security in a more practical way. And we'll focus on 3 configuration interfaces. How to configure web thin clients in the InduSoft Web Studio in a secure manner. How to configure the Microsoft IIS web server. Also to increase security when you use IIS as the web server between the InduSoft Web Studio and the web thin clients. And finally, we'll provide an overview about the InduSoft Web Studio security system, which plays an important role not only for the security of the local application, but also for the thin clients, since they share the same security system applied for the local station. After my presentation, Bruce Kyle from Microsoft will present the Microsoft guidelines for system security, and he will share different resources, tools, and guidelines from Microsoft specifically about system security, and we can apply all those concepts when creating projects within the InduSoft Web Studio. Having said that, let's get started with system security. So this is a very simple but typical application just to demonstrate the main concepts that apply in a thin client application. So in this simplistic diagram here, you have a server running in the InduSoft Web Studio and collecting data from the PLCs, from the remote IOs, from the RTUs through the control network. Could be one or more different physical layers here. And this network is typically critical from the control point of view because that's what's controlling the machines, the process per se. And the devices in this network are not necessarily safe from the communication and protocols point of view, especially when you work with legacy systems, legacy PLCs, their protocols, their internal structure may not be designed to be secure enough against cyber attacks or external attacks. So in the InduSoft Web Studio running on this computer and talking to the PLCs, collecting data, saving this data to the database, works as a shield for this control network, as well as a bridge, as a gateway between the remote users, the thin client users, and the information from the process. So the thin client users do not hit the control network directly. Ideally, you run in the InduSoft Web Studio in a computer that's connected at least to 2 different networks. The control network where we have the PLCs, the controllers, the I/O, and a business network, a different network where you have the thin clients connected to this computer through the local area network or through the internet. And typically on this link you have some sort of firewall to make sure you have extra protection between the thin clients and access to your network, to the server where InduSoft Web Studio is running. And Bruce will talk about this in more details, but when you talk about security, system security, there is not one magic bullet that solves the problem. It's all about creating layers and layers of security and making it as hard as possible for remote attackers to get into the system. So it's all about making it hard for someone to attack the system, and if they do, minimize the effects and report this information so you can take actions, even remedy actions, as soon as you identify that someone is trying to attack your system. So let's talk a little bit about how it works behind the scenes when web thin clients connect to InduSoft Web Studio application. So in one computer you run InduSoft Web Studio, and the data server to provide tag values, security system information, history information to the thin clients is a task, a thread from InduSoft Web Studio called TCP/IP server. So on the development environment, when you go to tasks, this TCP/IP server is the task responsible to send tag values, online information, history information from the InduSoft Web Studio runtime station to the thin client stations. However, you need another server to provide not the tag values, but the files, the screen files, the HTML files, the bitmaps, the JPEGs. So you need a web server to provide those files via standard protocols like HTTP or HTTPS. So the web thin client can download the files from the web server, and it can receive the tag values or history data from the InduSoft data server, the TCP/IP server from InduSoft. The web server, which we recommend using the IIS web server from Microsoft, and the data server, which is the TCP/IP server module from InduSoft, could be running on the same computer, but not necessarily. You could run InduSoft in one computer and just copy the files from the web subfolder of the application to another computer where you have the Microsoft web server, where you have the IIS web server. So in this case, you are even create an extra layer here. So if an attacker reaches the web server, they have one more step to go until they reach the InduSoft Web Studio computer. But it's not necessarily they will be in different computers. The data server and the web server technically could be running on the same computer. So especially if they are running on the same computer, you cannot run two different TCP/IP servers listening to the same port. So if you have a web server here from Microsoft listening to the port 80 or to the port 443 for HTTPS, the TCP/IP server from InduSoft cannot listen to the same port. It cannot bind to the same port. So the web thin client needs to connect to two servers, the web server and the data server, but they have to have different ports. On the other hand, we want to avoid you to open additional ports in the firewall to talk with the InduSoft data server. So the solution we created is what we call InduSoft Web Tunneling Gateway, which is a web service for the Microsoft IIS web server, which receives the requests from the InduSoft web thin client from the remote browser via HTTP or HTTPS and forward those requests to the InduSoft Web Studio TCP/IP server, which by default is listening to the port 1234. And if you want here through project communication, you can customize a different port for the TCP/IP server from InduSoft. But this way, even though you have a server here listening to the port 1234 and another server here listening to the port 443, the web thin client just needs to go through the firewall through one port, the port 443, and the web tunneling gateway running as a web service for IIS web server will forward this information to InduSoft Web Studio. So the first question is how to install the InduSoft Web Tunneling Gateway. If you run InduSoft and the web server on the same computer, when you install InduSoft Web Studio, the Web Tunneling Gateway is automatically installed along with the product. If the web server is in a different computer, all you have to do is go to the directory where you installed InduSoft Web Studio under the bin subfolder, and there is one executable called webtunnelinggateway.exe. It's a setup file, it's an executable file. Just copy this file, to the computer where you have the web server and run it there. It will install the InduSoft Web Tunneling Gateway on the web server computer. So it's that simple. Now, when you create the configuration, the application with InduSoft, you should configure InduSoft and tell the WebThing clients to use the Web Tunneling Gateway. So the interfaces you use to configure that are here in Project, Web, Thing Client. You have this field called Data Server IP Address. If this field, in this field, you pretty much write the IP address that the Web Tunneling Gateway will use to forward the information to the data server. In other words, you write here the IP address of the computer where the TCP/IP server module is running. In other words, the computer where InduSoft Web Studio is running. So the IP address in this field is the IP address of the computer where InduSoft Web Studio is running. Here in Advanced, you have this option to enable the Web Tunneling Gateway. And in this case, you can define here if you want to use HTTP or SSL, Security Socket Layer, which is strongly recommended, especially if the WebThing clients are in a public external network like the internet. Then if you enable here SSL, the WebThing client will communicate data with InduSoft Web Studio through the Web Tunneling Gateway, but it will use the SSL encryption from Microsoft to do that. And in this case, you just have to type here in the IP field, IP address field, the IP address of the computer where the Web Tunneling Gateway is running. The WebThing client uses this information to reach the Web Tunneling Gateway. And then once the package is received, the Web Tunneling Gateway uses this information to reach the InduSoft TCP/IP server. So from the InduSoft point of view, that's all you have to configure. And by the way, if InduSoft Web Studio is running on the same computer where the web server is running, you can even leave those two fields in blank, the data server IP address and the Web Tunneling Gateway IP address. You just have to enable the gateway and select TCP or SSL, SSL for HTTPS. And you can leave the IP address in blank and data server IP in blank if InduSoft Web Studio and the Web Tunneling Gateway are running on the same computer where the web server is running, because InduSoft automatically uses the IP address, the URL that the user typed on the browser to reach the gateway, and then the gateway will reach the InduSoft Web Studio on the same computer. So after configuring InduSoft Web Studio, the last step is to configure the Microsoft Web Server to use encryption. So you would go to Control Panel. Under Control Panel, you would have Administrative Tools, and then you can run the Internet Information Services, which opens an interface similar to this one. The first step would be, ideally, create what is called a server certificate. A server certificate is pretty much a digital signature for your server, and certificate authorities like VeriSign or GeoTrust are companies that can sell you those certificates. So if you go to verisign.com, for example, you can purchase a certificate from VeriSign and click on this icon here to apply this certificate to your server. What it pretty much tells to the remote thing clients is that this server is trustworthy. At least it has a certificate that was issued by a certificate authority company that made some kind of background task to make sure that whoever requested this certificate is a serious company, is at least someone that passed a minimum background check. I do not have a certificate here for the demonstration, so just to make a quick test, I can click on this icon and click here create self-signed certificate, which is good enough for testing purposes. But if you are deploying a real-world application and you want to expose it to remote users through the internet, we strongly recommend you to purchase a certificate from a certificate authority company like VeriSign. Then you go to the website level, where you have the basic configuration, where you define here the URL for the web subfolder of the application, the path for the web subfolder of the application. And then here under the website, you use the option Edit Bindings to define that InduSoft, the WebThing clients, this server will accept connections on the port 443. You can add it if it is not on the list. And here in Edit, you can apply a certificate to this website. So it pretty much means when WebThing clients try to connect to this web server, they will connect using the HTTPS protocol using the standard port 443, and they will have access to this certificate associated to this port. The last step is just to enable SSL, Security SOC Layer, for the web server. So all you have to do is select here your default website, double click on the SSL settings, and check the checkbox saying that the communication between the WebThing clients and the server will require Security SOC Layer with 128 bits encryption. So it makes extremely difficult or virtually impossible for hackers to sniff the network between the client and the servers and figure out the protocol by them. Send invalid commands to open, close valves, or steal information, data from your project. After doing that, all you have to do is run the application on the server, open a web browser. I'm gonna open the web browser here, and on the web browser type HTTPS, the IP address of the server, and the name of the screen that you want to use. So when you enable SSL, you use HTTPS instead of HTTP. And in this case, I do not have a certificate signed or provided by a certificate authority. So it pretty much says that it does not recognize the signer of the certificate and ask if the user wants to continue this way. But if you click here to continue anyway, it will connect with the server, and the WebThing client will exchange data with InduSoft Web Studio using the SSL encryption. And here in this PowerPoint presentation, which I will share with all the participants on the webinar, there are detailed information, step-by-step information about how to configure IIS, and I pretty much summarized the main steps right now. Moving to the InduSoft security system. So after the user went through the connection with the server, encryption of the information, and they hit the InduSoft data server, there is another layer of protection, which is the built-in security system from InduSoft, which is pretty much the main shield between the thin clients and the control network. And the security system from InduSoft can be configured here on the Global tab. You just right-click on Security, go to Settings, and you can enable the security system. And InduSoft Web Studio supports 4 modes of security. What we call local only, when you create the users, the groups, and the passwords for this project, and they are used for this project only. The thin clients and the server share the same settings, but the settings are valid for this project only. So it's a local mode. In some cases, you have more than one computer running InduSoft Web Studio, and it would either redundant systems, cascades redundant system, hot standby redundancy, different architectures, and it's convenient for you that all those computers running InduSoft Web Studio share the same security system, are synchronized with the same security system. So if you change the passwords in any one of those computers, all the other computers running InduSoft Web Studio are updated with the new password. If you create a user or remove a user, you want to synchronize this information throughout all those computers. So all you have to do is select one of those computers as the security system server and select here distributed server in that computer. And in the remaining computers running InduSoft Web Studio, you select here distributed client and type here the IP address of the computer running InduSoft Web Studio, of the computer you elected as the security system server. After doing that, InduSoft will synchronize the security system between the distributed clients and distributed server computer automatically. And all the thin clients connected to any one of those servers will share the same security system as well. And fourth option is what we call domain. Using the LDAP protocol, you can share the users and groups and settings from your Active Directory database from your domain. So pretty much the same users and passwords and groups that you have on the Windows level to log on to the operating system, for example, would be available to your application. So you do not have to create the users manually, create the groups manually, manage the passwords manually with InduSoft Web Studio. You just type here the domain name and a username and password that has access to the Active Directory, and InduSoft Web Studio will automatically show here all the groups from your domain, and you can just assign the InduSoft rights for each one of the groups from your domain. But if IT creates a new user or changes the password, those changes are automatically reflected to InduSoft Web Studio and all the thin clients connected to this server. So those are the four modes of the InduSoft security system. And after you define one of the modes, the next step is to define the rights, the settings for the groups. Because the way it works, you create the groups or you share the users from the groups from your Active Directory, and then the users are assigned to one or more groups, and the users have the rights from the groups that are assigned for each user. So you do not assign rights or restrictions to each user. You just assign groups to the users, and you assign rights and restrictions on the group level. There are two main different areas here, what we call security rights for development, and the second one is security rights for runtime. So here on the left side, the main focus is to make sure that you protect your application so other users cannot modify your application, even if they have the InduSoft Web Studio development tool. So you could come here and define an access level range for this particular group, and when you create scripts, worksheets, screens, you assign access level, security level for those documents, and only groups that have this access level in the range will be able to modify those documents. On the right side, the focus is only during the runtime. So for instance, if I say here the users from the guest group have the security level from 0 to 50. And then I go to a particular screen here, for instance, this food screen, and I say here in the screen attributes that the security level for this screen is 250. It means that users from the guest group will not be able to even open this screen during the runtime. They will not be able to visualize this screen during the runtime because they do not have enough security credentials to open this screen. Or I could say everybody can see this screen, but in order to click on this button, so I go to the commands dynamic, in order to click on this button, they need to have the security access level 250, for example. So guest users can open the screen, but they will not be able to execute this command. So using the security system, and especially this configuration here for the groups, for the runtime, you can restrict what each user can and cannot do on the project level, screen level, or object level. And there are some interesting options here, like for instance close project and task switch enabled, that do not affect the web thin clients when you have the web browsers, but affects the local viewer, the local server, and the secure viewer thin clients as well. And if you uncheck those two options for a particular group, users from this group will not be able to shut down the application, and they will not be able to switch to the desktop or to any other application during the runtime. So it's a way to lock the operator on the application and make sure that users from this group do not have rights to open the browser and download files, play with Facebook, download virus, games, and things like that. You lock the operator on the application itself. And there are some advanced options here for the group configuration that are quite interesting and recommended, especially for when you have web thin clients in an external network. Like for instance, password aging. You can force the users from this group, for example, to change their passwords every 30 days or 60 days or 5 days or every year, every number of days that you define here. And when they change their passwords, you can define rules for the new password. Like for instance, minimum size, for instance, 8 characters, special characters, for instance, with this configuration, users from this group will be forced to change their passwords every 30 days. And when they do that, their passwords must be at least 8 characters long, have at least 2 special characters, 2 numerical characters, and 2 alpha characters, and be case sensitive. So they are just rules to make sure that when the users change their passwords, they create strong enough passwords that cannot be easily guessed or figured out. And there is also options here like auto log off. So you can say, for example, if the user does not use the browser, the web thin client, for at least 5 minutes, then we automatically log off the user from that station. And you have another nice option here to disconnect the web thin client when you auto log off. So you release a web session license on the server for a new web thin client. In this other option here, account auto lockup allows you to lock users and avoid attackers to find out passwords by retries. So you can say, for instance, if someone tries to log on at least 3 times within, let's say, 10 minutes with the wrong password, you lock that user. And then the administrator has to go back here and unlock that user manually. They could go here to the list of users on the security system, right-click on the user, and unlock the user if the user is blocked. And on the event logger, if you enable the option security system, InduSoft will log to the event viewer those attempts to log on with invalid passwords, and it will tell you when it happened, which user was trying to log on with the wrong password, and what's the IP address of the computer where the attack came from. So again, there is not a magic bullet, but there are many tools, many layers, many settings that you can use to increase the security as much as possible. Having said that, I would like to invite Bruce now to share his desktop and present the Microsoft guidelines about system security. So welcome, Bruce, and feel free to start when you are ready.
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Bruce Kyle. And I'm an architect evangelist with Microsoft. I work with software companies across the United States. My job is to help and I talk to the CTOs. We typically want to help software companies, such as InduSoft, get ready for whatever the next version of our operating system is, or our platforms. So I work with software companies on about 25 different products. And what I want to talk to you today about is a little bit about software security and kind of how we approach it at Microsoft and how we can, some lessons that you can take in implementing your systems. So you've decided that you want to get serious about security, and you may need some heavy security around your applications. And you want an elegant system that more than one person can use to open the gate, each using their own key. But if there's too many keys, if the system becomes too hard to use, people aren't going to use it, and smart users will do their best to get around all the locks. So too much security leads to systems that are hard to administer and maintain. So what you want to do is find the right balance. You want to find ways for you to analyze the most important security holes in your application, in your system, and you want to be able to use solid design principles. So we have developed since 2004 the the security development life cycle. There's an executive commitment around the SDL, and there's a public website that describes the practices. Every product at Microsoft has to go through these steps, and we make the steps available for everyone to look at and to use themselves, and we make tools available, and I'll show you some links at the end of the presentation that show you what you can use. Even when I was working in a product group, even as a technical writer on the project, we had training and understood the security requirements of the project. The earlier you get started in it, the better. So here we start talking about security is not something you bolt on to your security environment. What it is, you start as early as you can. The earlier you can bake in the security requirements and your thought process around security, the easier it is to maintain and to make sure that your applications are secure. The key point in the security development lifecycle is that it includes every aspect of the software development. You can use the security development lifecycle in your own projects too. You can begin with training, analysis of the threats and the risks, and you can begin to define the quality gates and do your own analysis. You can verify the threat model and the attack surface, and you can put a response plan into place for what actions to take whenever a risk may show up. Now, the security development lifecycle has various levels has different maturity levels, and you may be really strong in one area, you might be dynamic in one and basic in another. But the point is that the process improves over time, and the deeper and deeper that you get involved in security, the better the security of your software and processes are. So I want to talk about some of the core design principles around security. Developing trusted applications requires that sound security and privacy decisions are made early in the design phase. Decisions made in those phases will highly influence subsequent efforts. And we found that it's actually less expensive to do it to bake in the security design principles earlier. This is because applications developed against more security and privacy-aware designs tend to be exposed to fewer threats and contain less vulnerabilities. In the remainder of the presentation, I'll briefly review each of the principles that I mentioned and how they can apply to ensure a better application design. So the first principle is attack surface reduction. The attack surface of an application is the portion of the program, code or functionality, that's exposed to a particular person or to another program. For example, an open network port or a user interface are examples of the application's attack surface. One of the most effective security design principles is around the idea of attack surface reduction. What this does is it minimizes attack surface while still satisfying the functional requirements of the application. Remember I talked earlier about the idea that too much security means that people have to do workarounds. Well, in this case, it's about attack surface reduction, because if you eliminated your entire attack surface, people couldn't get their jobs done. So let's take an example. We're going to be, in this case, we're going to be a home security company, and we want to protect the home from being burglarized. In the front of the house, we have several doors and windows that a burglar could use to exploit. And on the side of the house, we have even more. We have a couple of windows that the burglar could get through. And in addition, don't forget the chimney. Like our house, applications have various points where they're exposed to people or other programs or computers. And each one of these can be exploited by maliciousness and with an attack surface. So our goal is to minimize the number of potential vulnerabilities that a bad guy might be able to use. To reduce the attack surface, we need to first understand how to measure the attack surface. Attack surface analysis is the process of identifying and understanding all of the entry points that comprise the attack surface. We know that we're done, or that we've successfully performed it, when we have listed or enumerated all of the interfaces, protocols, and code execution paths. Another important element of the attack surface analysis is understanding the trust levels required for access to each entry point. For each entry point, you should consider the importance of the feature that it enables. For features that are not so important to the majority of users, turn those features off. Disable it by default, and do not even install it by default. Force the users that really want or need this feature to take an explicit action to obtain that feature. And that way, the vulnerability related to a specific feature will affect only a very small percentage of the user's product base. This attack surface analysis is an iterative process. For each feature that you analyze, you must also analyze each of the sub-features. And then again, that you want to restrict access to those features as much as possible. For example, if your application processes, in general, processes files, you want to configure it to read only the most common file types that it accepts. You want to force a user to explicitly configure it to process a less commonly used file type. You want to disable old and faulty and less used protocols such as SSL v2 or PCT. You want to force users to use more robust alternatives such as SSL v3 or TLS, or to force them to explicitly configure the application to accept those older protocols. It's not just about turning things off either. For example, you may want to instead of using UDP as a network protocol, you want to use TCP, which is more easily secured. Or instead of making a network service internet accessible, you might make it available only internally on an intranet basis. You can also use the attack surface reduction to enforce the principle of least privilege, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Here's some examples of what we do in our current products. Let's just take a couple of them. For example, firewall is on by default now, and it closes all but the specified required ports. When services are necessary out of the box, they are restricted to local host access. And functions and features that have been proven to induce unnecessary, undesirable risk in the past are now turned off by default. The next core principle I want to talk about is basic privacy. And the idea of privacy is a little bit different than that of security. And you see that they have the Venn diagrams there that kind of overlap. Privacy, like security, is another key factor. Privacy focuses on the control and choices a user has regarding the use, collection, and distribution of their personal information. Security, on the other hand, is applied to protect assets, including personal information from threats. So you can have a really well-designed application that is perfectly secure but may not respect people's privacy. For example, you may have an application that has credit card information, and if you pass it to a third party, you may do so securely, but you may not do so with the knowledge of the other person, of the person whose private personal information you're shipping. Let's consider a scenario: securing stored personal information and then sending it along a securely encrypted communication channel to third parties without properly notifying and receiving consent from a user may be securely implemented, but obviously does not take the consideration of the rights of the users into consideration. And these rights may have legal implications. For example, we have the Child Online Protection Act. So if you have an application that's targeting users under 13, you need to be able to handle information and privacy around this. There's also other acts, and probably one of the ones that I talk to most about with users is the HIPAA, is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Now, Microsoft has developed the Microsoft Privacy Guidelines for development of product and services to help this. And this is actually an online document that you can obtain. The document has two sections. The first section is definitions and key concepts around data types, notices, and consent. And the second section categorizes by specific development scenarios such as the collection and transfer of personally identifiable information, storage of data on the customer system, and how you can transfer that information to third parties. Probably one of the most interesting areas for me is this idea of threat modeling. A threat, please don't confuse threats with vulnerabilities. A threat is simply what an adversary might try to do to compromise a protected resource in a system. Vulnerability is a specific way that threat is exploited based on an unmitigated attack path. A person in an application design group with security expertise often leads this threat modeling activities. And let's just talk about this kind of in a nutshell. But the idea is that you can start with this vision. Activities begin by envisioning the application as it will be used by typical users in a typical environment. And then as step by step, you continue by identifying all the potential threats to the application and the assets. The threat modeling continues by creating a number of data flow diagrams, and these model the trust boundaries between the application and its components and the flow of data between the application and the environment. Once you've completed the model, then the threat modeling process is to determine the types of threats facing the application and list all of the data flow diagram elements. Knowing what needs to be protected and how they will be attacked enables you to choose the appropriate mitigation for each threat. Notice that we're still in the design phase of the application development. We are now designing security controls into a product based on the most likely threats and the most cost-effective juncture to address each of the considerations. We published a threat modeling tool that we use internally and that you can go ahead and download too. One of the other core principles is defense in depth. A key perspective of the idea of defense in depth is that all applications and hardware will eventually fail. If you go back to the burglar breaking into the house scenario, all the doors and windows of the house could be locked to keep the burglar out. Those might fail, so an alarm system could be installed. And the alarm system might fail, so the valuables in the house could be placed into a safe. In the context of the design and developing of trusted applications, this means that privacy and security features and mechanisms defending our applications will fail. Unfortunately, many applications today are designed and implemented in such a way that the application can be compromised when a single and often only layer defense fails or is breached. So let's take an example of this. Most applications or most environments have a firewall. But if you get through the firewall, you can get right straight to the data, and then you have a breach. On the other hand, if the application is designed with defense in depth, you can have multiple layers of defense protecting it. And I think you've seen that in a lot of the InduSoft demonstration that we had earlier today. But in this case, the defense layers like input validation, smart card or host level access, or IP security at the network level, these are examples of additional layers of defense that you can use to protect your application. So one of the things you can do is look at your current hotspots in your application, and you can see that even in the browser or firewall, there are various places you can intercede. Your application can do several things. It can handle exceptions, it can validate input, but at each step along the way, you can provide hot defense in depth. The next area, the core principle, is least privilege. With the least period principle, we assume that all applications will be compromised. However, by employing the principle of least privileges, any malicious user who compromises the application actually has the least amount of damage possible. Let's take an example here. Let's say that a person has access to the local system. And if the person has admin level set, they can read user files, change passwords, download files, it can do anything. But if the person is interested as a non-admin, they can't do many of the things. They can't read the files, they can't change system passwords, and they can't download malicious files, so they have limited capabilities, and their ability to do damage is much more mitigated. We do a lot of this kind of thing on our new Windows Azure product, where the application actually runs in the least amount of privileges possible needed for you to actually do the job, but they don't get to do many of the things that cause issues on other kinds of systems. here are some tips. Think minimally. Ask yourself what is the minimum access your application needs to function correctly. And if your application requires higher privilege, then allocate those privileges only when required and release those privileges immediately after the purposes for which the privileges have been satisfied. Another one is secure defaults. In the previous section I talked about these privileges. In this one we talk about attack surface reduction. Recall that with attack surface reduction principle, any non-critical part of the application that was exposed to human or system was removed and disabled by default. In this one, we want to be sure to deploy the application that ensures the customer has a safer experience with our applications out of the box, rather than after a whole bunch of extensive and manual configurations. So basically the idea is that we configure the application around the idea of security. The application is full functional, but then we ask the user to go ahead and enable other ones. So here's some examples. Again, the firewall is on by default. Here's another example. SSL socket. If your application can read data through the socket, then the default is set to v3. Password complexity. If your application can require users to have complex passwords, then that feature should be enabled by default. Oh, and probably one of the key ones is you never store user passwords. What you do is you store the hashes. So we talked about the security development lifecycle. We talked about many of the secure design principles. There's a book that we have that describes the security development lifecycle there, and then we have the official security development lifecycle website, which is Microsoft.com/SDL. There's also some threat modeling resources, so you can use these to both as a threat modeling tool and as in a threat modeling book. And software developers, we have the official website for Microsoft Security. So safer applications begin with secure planning and design. Your systems begin with secure planning and design. Be sure to use the core principles, and be sure to look at your applications to find out where people can exploit, and they can, and when you mitigate those, you'll be able to have a safer and more secure system that people will actually use. Fabio.
Well, Bruce, thank you very much. It was excellent. I appreciate you taking the time to share those guidelines with us. And having said that, we're gonna open for Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the Q&A box from WebEx or even on the chat. And Bruce, I think this one is good for you. What's the operating system recommended by Microsoft when hosting applications on premises? So I believe the question is if they run the server portion of the application on premises, not on the cloud, what is the operating system that Microsoft recommends from the security point of view?
Our current one that is one of the best is Windows Server 2008 R2. They have the most. It's the most up to date and like that. But regardless of what operating system you choose, we recommend that you always get the security updates. So you know, even if you're using an older version of the operating system, you should always get the updates. Make sure that your operating system is patched.
Very well. And InduSoft Web Studio supports today all the operating systems currently supported by Microsoft, including Windows 2008 Server R2, 32 or 64 bits. Mostly, in most cases, 64 bits. Another question is if it's possible to enable SSL on Windows CE. It depends on the image from your device provider, your manufacturer, but Microsoft, the web server from Microsoft on Windows CE supports SSL. And InduSoft Web Studio provides the gateway, CE View provides the gateway, web tunneling gateway for Windows CE as well. So as long as the hardware manufacturer did not block or remove this option when they created the image for the device, it would be possible to use SSL from Windows CE. Let me see here, any other questions? Bruce, this one, I would like to get your feedback as well. They're asking about what's the antivirus recommended by Microsoft.
What's the what virus?
Antivirus. Protection against virus, like Symantec.
Virus protection.
Exactly.
We have our, we use Forefront, and so we have a product line called Windows, Microsoft Forefront.
Mm-hmm. And is there an extra charge for the Microsoft Forefront?
Yes, there is.
Okay.
Yeah, you can get that. You can get that through any of the resellers.
Very well. I learned something new.
Just gonna look. Yeah, let me see what I'm using. I'm using System Center endpoint protection on my local laptop right now.
Okay. Well, once again, I would like to thank everybody for participating here and for promoting the InduSoft webinars. Special thanks for Bruce Kelly from Microsoft, who helped us co-hosting this webinar. And I do hope to see you again in 2 weeks and on the next InduSoft webinars. Thank you, everybody, and have a great evening.